All right, we are live. Welcome in, everybody, to The Slate. We are a daily DraftKings show, Monday through Friday. We come to you live after our Madden simulation, and we're in the 5 Eastern hour. We'll take you up until 5 minutes of 6 or so. Gary and Thorne, Brendan Glasheen. We've got Eamon and Matt behind the glass, behind the scenes, if you will, getting us up and running. And we will dive into quite a bit on this show. Garian focused these days in the NBA, does a good job for us over on the DK Playbook, also over at DK Nation. You can find his work there as the second half. I put second half in air quotes. There's like 20 games left. We have a fourth, which I kind of like. I do like how it is coming, but it's worth to keep bringing up to people because I think folks are like, oh yeah, NBA, plenty of time. No, this season, it's almost over. Like we're getting close. So we'll dive into some NBA. MLB, I think Julian Edlow doing yeoman's work on the on his Twitter. I mean, they pay this guy the big bucks, folks.
Big baseball guy, Julian Edlow.
Big baseball guy. I mean, I'm looking forward to the two-way parlays in July. I'm going to take Verlander first 5, and I'm going to take Garrett Cole first 5, and I'm giving Jules a hard time. I see Gary. I'm not sure. I see Jules. Me and Jules, we actually hang out off of the DK world, and we spend some time. And he's a nice fellow. I will say he's a lot nicer in person. A lot of these guys I work with at DraftKings are a lot nicer in person than they are online. So I'm sure you've run into that from time to time.
I mean, I've only been to Boston one time. I saw a couple guys in New York back, I think, like the 2018 Fantasy Baseball Championships or something like that. So, yeah, everyone's been super nice.
Yeah, so it's good. It's good. And, like, they're nice online, too. I'm, like, joking, but you
get a sense of out here, like, requesting specific props on the DraftKings Sportsbook where it's, like, Mariners wins versus Blue Jays wins straight up and, like, tagging me in it. So, you know, there's a little animosity sometimes.
Yeah, like, Bukes forgets – it's weird to say 3 years ago, but I remind Bukes every once in a while, like, dude, you're out of a job. They weren't going to have a freaking baseball season. You know, I like throwing that at him every once in a while. Now they had a season and I had to eat crow, but anywho, it's all a long way of saying it's one big happy family. The same family issues you may deal with, we deal with them here at DK. Anywho, what are your latest developing thoughts on the NBA landscape as we head into the final stretch of this regular season? Take it whatever direction you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I use big here tentatively, but the NBA has done a very nice job of making sure they are always dominating the headlines. The buyout market is kind of in the spotlight at the moment, and I think with each passing year, I think the casual NBA fan understands more and more that the buyout market is not exactly an impactful situation. Generally speaking, buyout players do not have all that much sway when it comes to like the NBA championship or even having all that much impact in DFS, although that really depends on whether or not we're talking about the more established teams or the teams that are maybe attempting to tank, because you could have a guy come in on a buyout and suddenly have a massive role. Like Russell Westbrook for, I don't know, like 48 hours, it seemed like maybe reuniting with the Wizards was on the table. And you're like, oh, he could just go be Russell Westbrook with the Wizards. Like they would probably embrace that and say, hey, go be the guy you were 2 seasons ago who got us into the playoffs. But as we know, Russell Westbrook ends up in Los Angeles, and it's surprising to me. And it's, I think, just shocking in general that we are hearing murmurs that Westbrook could possibly end up in the Clippers starting lineup. And look, they've been looking for a point guard all season long. That has been the consistent narrative with the Clippers since they broke camp. Obviously, they have moved on from Reggie Jackson. They've been starting Terrence Mann, who has looked, in my opinion, relatively good as their point guard. And again, when you're playing point guard next to the likes of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, and even to a lesser extent, Norman Powell, you're not going to have the ball in your hands all that much. You're not going to be asked to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But to me, you know, they bring in John Wall on a flyer and it doesn't work out and they've moved on. And to bring in Russell Westbrook, like, I just don't see it being all that different than the John Wall scenario. Now, granted, Westbrook was putting up numbers as a sixth man with the Lakers. And, all reports were that he'd bought into that role, that we were somewhat skeptical coming into the season that he would ever play off the bench. But I just think that he's been a net negative player for the Lakers for the better part of 2 seasons now, specifically on defense. And I'm just surprised that he might have as big a role with the Clippers as reports are maybe indicating he might, because I think Glash, you might agree with me on this. One of the Clippers' biggest issues for the most of the season, aside from just the constant health scenarios surrounding Kawhi and Paul George, they've got too many players. They've got too many rotation players on this team. And I think it just leads to some a little uneasiness in the locker room. It's their rotations seemingly change every single night. I feel like this is a team that needed some consistency. And instead, you've now got a team that's got to work in Eric Gordon and Bones Highland and Russell Westbrook. I just don't see it all meshing together.
So this is now 5 teams in 6 years. And where these murmurs of Westbrook starting, it came from a report in The Athletic that's where it seems it's heading for Westbrook. And it should be noted that Clippers are plus 900 on the DK Sportsbook to win the NBA championship. Those odds have not changed since the addition of Russell Westbrook. It is the same exact number. So again, we're breaking it down from how does that move the needle? It doesn't really move the needle. And we're getting used to guys like Westbrook. Okay, well, hey, look, he's coming off the bench. Come on, the guy's ultimately sacrificing, but it's the way in which he plays still. As you kind of said, it's a net negative. And I thought, I remember the chatter at the beginning of the season when the Clippers, again, you don't know what lineup you're going to get with George in or out, or Leonard in or out. I thought Wall, they were based on the commentary, like Clippers, deepest team in the NBA. They can go 10 deep. John Wall gives them quality minutes. I thought Wall early on in the year, and that's easy to say early in the year. Everyone's fresh, full off season. There's no wear and tear of a regular season. I thought Wall looked pretty good there. And he goes back to Houston, gets bought out. So John Wall is still out there, right? He's available.
Yep. I mean, and that's the thing about the buyout market is I think we're in a point right now where we're debating in terms of who's the top buyout option remaining. And it's John Wall and it's Will Barton. And you're like, okay, again, these are not guys who are going to change the dynamic of the NBA championship odds. I will say that of this cycle and some of the bigger names, the more, over the hill type big names we tend to see in the buyout market, I'm probably the most bullish on Kevin Love having a little bit more left in the tank and being able to contribute a little bit better than some of these guys we usually see sign in this period. I mean, the Heat have been pretty shallow this season. Obviously, Kyle Lowry not really working out for them like they had hoped a couple seasons back. This is a team that's starting like Caleb Martin, Hunter Highwood is playing considerable minutes for them every single game. I don't think the Heat rotation is what we thought the Heat rotation would be. I mean, Kevin Love has not been shooting well since the start of November, and that's obviously the biggest part of his game at this point in his career. Still is a relatively good rebounder, but, was always at best average on defense, and now kind of losing a step is not helping with that. But I think Love is what last season Kevin Love was one of the 2 runaway options for 6th man of the year. I do think he's probably got the capacity to still be able to help the Heat. That being said, I think with the way the Brooklyn Nets situation worked out, with Kyrie leaving, with Kevin Durant leaving, we're now left with a pretty clear landscape of the Eastern Conference. There are 4 really good teams in the Eastern Conference. And you could even say that the Celtics and the Bucks are on a tier of their own.
Yep.
And then you've got the 76ers and the Cavaliers below them. But after that, I think it's all kind of like a wash. The Knicks and the Heat, and to some extent the Nets, but a lot of that, again, is built up wins from Kevin Durant. They're probably that next tier. And then you've got the Wizards, Bulls, Hawks, Raptors tier. It seems to me that the Celtics, the Bucks, the Cavaliers, and the 76ers are going to be in the Eastern Conference semifinals playing each other in some capacity. I think the Heat could have gotten better by signing Kevin Love yesterday, but I don't think it changes the fact they're not getting out of the first round of the playoffs.
we're compartmentalizing name recognition with, okay, look, they just got Kevin Love. Oh, Kevin Love considered Miami. He also considered a chat with the Sixers. Now, to your point, maybe if he goes to the Sixers, does that strengthen their opportunity? Possibly. It gives them more depth. I mean, I'm not trying to go all Adam Kaufman on you here, but as it relates to like Boston's turnaround last year, they didn't really change. Now they got Derek White, but they didn't really change the roster. It's just they playing to their capability, right? It's a whole different discussion. They didn't add a veteran and Derek White is a fringe veteran. He's still in the prime of his career, I think, but he doesn't have the name recognition of a Westbrook or a Love. But my point is, if we're going to say the same things now about teams adding, it shouldn't move the needle all that much. Whereas Boston, they just finally started playing to their potential of those star players. And that said, I mean, just an NBA point in general, most guys that win, star players that win, it takes them till year 6 or 7 to hit that peak. And it happens here in this area, Gary, and people like lose their minds. Like, oh, they've been to 3 Eastern Conference. They've been to 3 of the last 4 Eastern Conference finals. People move the needle a lot faster in a big market like here. Philly does the same thing. So yeah, I mean, my point being is the Celtics just finally played to their potential, and they're on their track. Their ascension is, in general NBA terms, not Boston terms or New England terms, just the expectation level is at a bigger. It's at a higher level locally, but nationally, it's like, yeah, they're still really, really young, but they exceeded that by going to the finals last year. How about in the West? We talked about the Clippers with the addition of Westbrook. Are you at a point where you look at the board now with the West, and you've got Denver, Memphis, even Sacramento? Those are your top 3. Sacramento, they're only a game up for third, but they're third in the West, and they're plus 5,000 to come out of the conference, which is wild. How certain are you of any of these teams that made moves? So Phoenix and Dallas made notable star player acquisitions, as we know. The Lakers even made tweaks, not stars, but they made tweaks, and
they got better. I think we can all agree they got better.
So where's your mind at with the West? Like the East, you said it, top 4, it feels pretty certain we're going to get some mix of those 4 in the semifinals of the East. In the West, are you looking at it and going, I need to see more. I need to see what it looks like.
So I think the one bet I've sort of latched onto in the West in recent days has just been kind of doubling down on the Nuggets. I think
to win the conference.
Conference or even NBA championship. Like, I think they're at that level. I think they're plus 750 to win the NBA championship.
That's correct. Yep.
The thing I like about the Nuggets is, and really what makes betting any team to do well in the West and go far in the West so complicated right now, is if you take a look, and you mentioned it with the Kings, if you take a look at the standings, they're all so tight and so bunched up. And you've also got
after Denver and Memphis, yes.
Yeah, and you've got these like possible grenades sitting towards the end of the conference. Like, there's a chance you could fight all season long if you're the Kings to be the 3 seed. And you finally get like home court advantage in a playoff series in Sacramento, and you've got to face the Warriors in round 1. Like, you've got to face the Clippers in round 1. You've got to face the Mavericks in round 1. Like, there's just going to be so much carnage, I think, in the first round of the Western Conference playoffs that I'd be more inclined, aside from the Nuggets, to maybe take a chance on some of these longer odds. But the Nuggets, the main reason I like them is I really think they've almost locked up the 1 seed. It would take something near catastrophic for them not to finish this season as the number 1 seed in the Western Conference. And while that means a lot in a vacuum to any team in the NBA, it's specifically important to Denver, who we know has a built-in home court advantage playing in the altitude in Denver. And that's played out statistically. It's not just a narrative. It has played out on the court season after season. And again, this year, by net rating, by a pretty sizable margin, they are the best home team in the NBA. So them locking up home court advantage is, I would say, that much more important than any other team doing it. So again, with the uncertainty we're seeing right now, and I know Phoenix is sort of like kind of hovering in the background, looming over Denver. They, their high end play is much better than anything Denver can do if everything clicks right. But I just think the Nuggets have that level of cohesion and they have that distinct home court advantage that they've almost certainly locked in. So I think there's a little bit of value that they've now have because of the moves the Suns have made and because of their ascension up the board.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's a healthy lead. They're up 5 games for first place over Memphis. And even like for Sacramento, I was just looking at defensive rating. Sacramento and Dallas are towards the bottom of the NBA in defensive rating.
Yeah.
Now that, of course, is full season. That doesn't imply, I just remember Dallas last year when Dallas, the Final Four in the NBA last year, Boston, Miami, Dallas, Golden State, all top of the league in defensive rating.
Yeah, Dallas was great on defense last year. Not so much this year.
Correct. This year it's been different, and that's why I almost give the Kings a shot in that series. If they do draw, now if they draw Golden State, I might feel a little differently. But as of now, it would be Sacramento and Dallas as a first-round matchup. Sacramento would avoid a Golden State. They would avoid even like a team like the Thunder would be sort of dangerous. The ship has sailed on the Thunder to be like this tanking team. The market still reflects Oklahoma City as if it's a tanking team. Well, they're a game under 500. And at this point, they're not in the Wembanyama sweepstakes. That ship has sailed. Like that's no longer a thing. So they're kind of in it. I mean, their roster is still rebuild-esque outside of SGA, but they're very much. I still think they're very much in the picture. Minnesota is one of those teams. They start playing to their potential. Maybe New Orleans. Good God, New Orleans is a mess.
Well, I mean, you kind of look at some of these teams too, and I think I would lump Minnesota. I mean, to some extent, Minnesota, but specifically New Orleans and Golden State kind of are in their own tier right now. Where who knows how this, again, quote unquote, second half is going to go. We're running out of games here.
Yep.
We don't have a definitive timeline on Steph. Steve Kerr was pretty clear that he's going to play again this season, but that doesn't mean he's going to be back in 2 weeks. It could be 4 weeks. And that could build up. It's a lot of time for Golden State to have to sort of tread water. Now, I think they have the pieces there. Klay Thompson, right before the break, was able to play in his first back-to-back of the season. That's encouraging. Jordan Poole obviously has the ability to score while Steph is not there. Andrew Wiggins is back from a very long mid-season absence. So they've got bodies. I think Golden State is equipped well enough to survive without Steph. The Zion re-update is not great for New Orleans. I think for a minute there, they almost seemed like they could be a value if Zion were to come back and they'd finally be healthy. And this was a team that was towards the top of the Western Conference when they had all their guys firing at the beginning of the season. And I think it really speaks to what the front office sort of maybe was picking up on the breadcrumbs of the Zion injury stuff, that they didn't do a lot at the trade deadline. Like, they had been a team that was heavily connected to OG Anunoby, even to Pascal Siakam. And they were just like, no, maybe not this year. Maybe they knew something that we didn't all know until recently about Zion.
Yeah. In their defense, they did do something last year. They went out and got McCollum. So, but you got to be, David Griffin's still running the show, right? In New Orleans. I mean, he's been aggressive. Now, granted, he's had LeBron in his office too, probably discussing what he wants to do. So in their defense, New Orleans did do something last year, but they're like, okay, if we don't feel like we're there this year, we're going to be careful and not get too crazy with assets.
Well, I think they were literally like in the middle of a 10-game losing streak the day of the trade deadline. Like, it's tough. It's tough when your star player's hurt. You've lost 10 games in a row and you've got to convince yourself as an office, like, no, we gotta go all in. We gotta go all in for this season. So I can kind of see what they were like. But I think the one guy who we really just haven't talked about for months is Karl Anthony Towns. Karl Anthony Towns is just sitting on a sideline wearing a suit in Minnesota. There have been very few updates on where his health is. I think the last update we got about 2.5 weeks ago was that we don't have a definitive timeline for when he's going to return.
Yep.
And again, I think Minnesota is inherently a flawed team. I think that you look back to when they were at their worst this season, it was with Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert having to share that front court. It just didn't seem natural. And maybe that comes with time, but all that time that they could have had to sort of find a rhythm, they've lost because of this injury. So I'm not even sure if adding Karl-Anthony Towns to the mix would be a positive for the Timberwolves, considering how bad they were at the beginning of the season when all those guys were healthy. But again, if we're talking all-stars who could come back and bring something to a team in the second half of the season, Karl-Anthony Towns is not a name that I'm hearing a lot.
21 games this year for the Wolves. Cat has been out due to injury. So we'll see. But it's because if you're a Western Conference front office, how do you not look at it and go, well, all those teams made those moves and we're not treading in the right, we're not heading in the right direction. How much buy-in do we want to have for this current season? So while everyone can say, oh yeah, the West is really open. It's tough. It's a weird year. It's a weird year.
Yeah.
In the West, that's for sure. Any other NBA thoughts before we work our way to baseball? Because I know
we touched on the Cavs in the Eastern Conference hierarchy a little bit. I would just say, sort of to your point, looking at the Kings Western Conference championship odds and going, wow, those seem kind of odd for a team where they are in the standings. If you look right now to win a championship, you've got the Celtics as the overwhelming favorite.
Yep.
You've got, rightfully so, the Bucks as the third shortest odds to win at 550. You've got the 76ers at 12-1. And like I mentioned, and I think we're on the same page with this, it's clearly a 4-team tier at the top of the East. And yet you've got the Cavaliers down at 30-1. I don't really think there's that much of a difference between the Cavaliers and the 76ers. Obviously there's more established stars on the 76ers with your Joel Embiids, and obviously your James Hardens, although Harden has his own playoff history. But I think, especially considering the 76ers have the hardest remaining strength of schedule in the NBA.
Their schedule coming out of the break is brutal. They could either turn some heads in a good way, or it could go south, or they could just tread water and go 500.
But I think there's a realistic chance that the Cavaliers could get the 3 seed in the Eastern Conference. And again, I don't think they can beat the Celtics. I don't think they can beat the Bucks in a series. However,
they match up well against Boston. I'll tell you what, those bigs, Mobley and Jared Allen, they gave this, and Donovan Mitchell, I think, is just a big game.
They're a good team. They're a really good team. So I just think 30-1. I was thinking, if I were to do these rankings in my head blind, I probably would have had the Cavaliers at like 18-1, 20-1. So to see them at 30-1 is a little shocking.
Okay, that's fair. I would agree. I mean, Cleveland has beat Boston twice in overtime, and I think they're now the Celtics have just got, when they played the Cavs early in the year, they didn't have Rob Williams back in a full-time role. Mm-hmm. And I put full, it's the league. You have to keep these asterisks in mind. Who has had a full-time role? And there's only a few guys you can count on one hand who have been in a full-time role all year. But Cleveland in games against Boston head-to-head have played well. I think if those two teams meet in a playoff series, that is no gimme. Like, it would be tough. I think Cleveland, because I don't want to hear how young Cleveland is. Like, the Celtics were young too, and they made runs to the conference finals. It happens. Now, granted, the East.
I think too, like, this is happening across all sports. Like, what is young anymore? Like,
I hear you.
You've got people.
We're guilty of it because we're talking about Kevin. And I think we agree, but we're guilty of it because we're like, ooh, Kevin Love buyout market. Oh, Russell Westbrook. It's like, we're past those guys now. Like, you know what I mean? Like that. But that's hard to process and create an angle in the moment when those kinds of guys are on the move. And then when you have guys that are injured, so you have your George Leonard dynamic, Karl-Anthony Towns. Kevin Durant's out. So it's a lot of unknown and a lot of projecting as opposed to actual results on the court. Mm-hmm. And what we're asking, or what we're wondering, is how do you look at the final 20 or so? In some cases, some teams have like 23 games remaining. How much more can we learn? And I think there is something to learn if they're legit. But if they're right and it's the playoffs, I mean, I from a Durant specific angle, I'm like, yeah, I mean, we saw what Durant could do. He was a shoe size away from being in the conference finals. Mm-hmm. With Brooklyn, and that all went to hell. And who's to say that do the Suns have enough time to piece it all together and be a legitimate threat? They could be. I'm not saying they won't be, but they're running out of time to prove it.
Sure.
It feels like we're doing a lot of like
probably having like a Chris Paul in the room. I think like
no, I know.
You know, they've got the sort of like, I think it's a pretty clear like role definition kind of thing they have going on. Obviously, DeAndre Ayton has been a little unhappy with how he's been utilized in Phoenix even before they got a guy like Kevin Durant and his usage rates. So we'll see, maybe how he's feeling now as the clear fourth option on a team where he thinks he could be a little bit more than that. But, as long as Devin Booker and Kevin Durant can kind of like gel a little bit and figure out the sort of like your turn, my turn kind of dynamics of this. And again, Kevin Durant has now played for super teams for the better part of his entire career. So, he's definitely used to playing with other high usage rate players and other all-star players who want the ball.
This is true. I just find like now and it's easy to say this because Kyrie and Durant are in the West, but now I feel like we're looking at like 5 or 6 teams now in the West, and we're almost giving them the same kind of coverage as we gave the Nets in the East. Well, if this all works and these guys all play, and if they play to their capability, and if this guy if Chris Paul plays to how we expect Chris, like we're just doing a lot of like, well, don't sleep on them. And that's what we did with the Nets now for the last couple of years. If they play to their ceiling, look out,
To go full circle, like, again, this is sort of why I think the Nuggets are a little undervalued right now, because they're just not sexy at all. Like they're just that team that keeps chugging along. Like somehow Nikola Jokic is going to win his 3rd MVP and everyone's going to be really upset. And it's just because they're good and they win and they're good. And like you said, we waited so long for that Nets team to do something, and they could never get it done. And there's a lot of outside circumstances that went into that, obviously. But sometimes continuity is a little overlooked because we just get infatuated with the new shiny thing. The Nuggets know how to play with each other. They're a solid team. They've got that built-in home court advantage, and there's just no drama. Like it's a nice team they've got there in Denver.
And as Matt points out, I mean, Jason Tatum's only 19, so it's like
always.
I forgot
that Peter Pan.
Real quick, I mean, they're not much of in the picture, but there was some news. Nate McMillan has been dismissed as the Atlanta Hawks head coach. You have a thought on that?
That kind of seemed like it had been percolating for a while. In Atlanta, they've had a very strange season. I think there were. It's kind of unclear what expectations were for Atlanta, to be honest. I think coming into this season, they trade a lot of draft capital to bring in DeJounte Murray. I think there was question marks about just how he fit and would he sort of force Trey to move off the ball. And that's maybe a role that Trey with his shooting is accustomed to or could be accustomed to, but that was going to be a weird fit. They were kind of clumped in with like, the Bulls, that sort of like lower end tier of Eastern Conference teams with expectation. Like, I don't think that they're necessarily below expectations. But again, making that Eastern Conference championship, regardless of how fluky it all seemed, regardless of how much we could pin it to just like Ben Simmons and him not wanting to take a shot in a big moment in Game 7, like, they got there. And sometimes that really messes with a team's timeline, and it messes with the perception of how they're viewed outside of their own organization. And we've now seen their GM who built that team move on. And we now see the head coach who turned them around that season go out the door amidst some locker room unrest. So at a certain point, it's like, what's the common denominator here? And the Hawks kind of are flying through coaches. I just don't know if that's a situation where McMillan was ever going to be able to do enough to live up to standards that were probably unfair in the first place.
Adrian Wojnarowski had that report on McMillan. He adds, the Hawks are starting a search for a new head coach immediately. Among the top characteristics in the search, player development, accountability, and getting the Hawks offense and defense into the league's top 10. So we can leave that at that. We have a couple minutes or under 10 minutes to go. Let's dive into what's your latest on Major League Baseball? How are you starting to pick apart American League, National League? What are some angles that you're taking a look at here in baseball?
Yeah, so we had win totals drop on the DraftKings Sportsbook last week, so that's always fun. We talked about a couple of these on the slate, but I can run through my favorites again.
Please.
Some of these are moving too. We were talking before the show, and we mentioned Julian already, but Julian tweeted out some of the line movement and some of the most popular MLB futures we've seen on the DraftKings Sportsbook so far this season. And the second most bet win total is the Diamondbacks over. It's now up to -120, obviously started at -110. I hopped on at -115. I think the Diamondbacks are going to be one of those teams that people want to do well. they're just going to be a fun team. They've got a bunch of prospects. They've got some sneaky good players. And they won 74 games last season. So really all you're projecting is one more win for the Diamondbacks, where, yeah, they lose Dalton Varsho, who was their most important player by both F-WAR and B-WAR last season. But, Zach Gallen's a stud. He finished top 5 in NL Cy Young voting. You've got Corbin Carroll, who might be the best young hitting prospect in all of baseball, probably the front runner to win Rookie of the Year in the National League. So there's a lot to like here. The reason they traded Varsho was essentially they just have so many young outfield prospects on the cusp of breaking out of AAA that they just needed to free up some at bats, and they also needed a catcher. And Gabriel Moreno, at one time, Baseball Prospectus #1 prospect in all of baseball. Like, suddenly he's there with Corbin Carroll building this really nice base. They've got some young electric pitching prospects. And they've got a solid major league core. They've got guys like Christian Walker, and they've got, they bring in even Lourdes Gurriel Jr., who's just a league average left fielder. Like, they've got adults in the room. And I think they're not a team that's going to go compete for the NL West crown this year. I think maybe that's more of like a 2024, 2025 goal of this Diamondbacks team that's clearly on the come up. But this kind of seems like that stepping stone season where they win maybe like 81 or 82 games and put the league on notice for next season. So I, like a lot of people, seem to like the Diamondbacks. It saddens me to say it, but I really like the Yankees. Their total is set at 94.5, which just seems too low. The Yankees have gone over this number in 3 of the last 4 full seasons.
Plus money over too.
Yeah,
even
it's a little surprising. And even Baseball Prospectus has their PECOTA projections, which
is that, well, just quickly, I know it's more than just a couple guys. I know baseball, it's 25 man roster and you get your pitching. Is that a reflection of the Cortez news? Possibly.
You mean the Montas?
Frankie Montas. What did I say? Cortez. Cortez is fine. Montas.
Yeah, Nestor's fine. I would probably, because that's the only thing I can think of as to why people would be somewhat hesitant. But that's almost one of my reasons to be optimistic about the Yankees. Is
okay.
I see that news last week and I go, they can survive that. Like, he was definitively going to be their 5th starter. They've got. Last season, I believe there were 129 pitchers who threw at least 100 innings. By expected ERA, they've got 3 of the best 15 pitchers in baseball last season in their starting rotation. And that doesn't include Garrett Cole, who led the league in strikeouts. Wow. So I just think their starting rotation and bullpen combination is probably the deepest in the American League. People kind of forget that they had just an absolutely terrible run from late July to mid-August, where everyone who was not named Aaron Judge was hurt. No one was hitting. And a team that at one point was on pace to win 120 games. And people were talking about, the 2021 Seattle Mariners and bringing up that sort of win projection. It all kind of got lost due to injuries. Like, I think the Yankees are clearly the best team in the American League East. They're still plus money to just win the American League East. I don't think that's a terrible bet if you want to go after that. But
who's in the running with them? Toronto?
Yeah, it's like, Toronto's just after them. I think the Rays are pretty close after that.
Yeah. So Yankees plus 110, Toronto plus 215, Rays plus 380, and so on. We won't talk about the Red Sox.
But
I do like the Red Sox over. It has moved too. That has moved.
A lot of people seem to. Yeah. And I don't disagree with that. And I actually think that the thing with the Red Sox over, it's a double-edged sword. You could look at this as a positive or a negative. Their early season schedule is ridiculously easy. So there's a very good chance that while their rotation is healthy, they're going to face some really easy teams and they should be able to take advantage and get some early wins. So this might be a situation where you're sitting there with a Red Sox win total over and they start the season, 15-8, and you're feeling really, really good about yourself. Yeah. I do worry a little about the sustainability of health in that rotation.
Fair enough.
Especially when that schedule starts to get a little tougher. But in general, I do think they're better than a 78-win team.
What helps them too, and I use the Red Sox as an example, they were so bad, generally speaking, but they were bad against their division. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And with the new schedule, which I think needs to be taken into consideration when you look at these win totals, now each team plays 13 games against their division as opposed to the 19 games. Yep. And you play more in the American League's case, they'll play more National League games. The NL will play more American League games. So that's to consider as well. When you look at some of the teams in the NL who aren't as strong as some of these offenses in the American League, that they are playing more games against the AL and vice versa.
1,000%. And I think you
and real quick, the other obvious note too is if the Red Sox aren't good, they might sell at the deadline, and then that's where it gets really dicey. And I'm thinking a ways away now, but when you get to that trade deadline, if you move off a couple of pieces, it changes everything. As far as where a team might be, they might move off some assets. But go ahead.
Yeah, possible. But I do think they and the Orioles specifically, if you had to circle the two teams that benefit the most from the new schedule, it is the Orioles and it is the Red Sox. Because, yes, the Yankees, Blue Jays, and Rays benefit from having to play two of those other three teams 6 fewer times, but it's the Red Sox and the Orioles who get 18 total fewer games against the Blue Jays, the Rays, and the Yankees, who are definitively, I would say, three of the best 6 teams in the American League without question. So, yeah, the flattening of the schedule is really important. And that's even another reason I kind of like the Diamondbacks, is just less games against the Padres, less games against the Dodgers. Like, I think it's going to be really interesting to see which divisions benefit and which suffer the most because of this. I think we all have our suspicions. It's going to be the American League East and the National League East who benefit the most. And it's going to be the two central divisions that benefit the least. But I still think like a team like the Twins is not properly valued in the futures market right now. Like they're plus 145 to make the playoffs. I don't hate that bet. Win
total 82.5.
So that's even started to go up. It was at 81.5 last week. So people seem to be getting the message. And I mentioned Pacoda projections by Baseball Prospectus. Like there's 1,000 projection systems. So you could really point at any of them, but I think Pacoda is pretty much the gold standard. They've got the Twins winning 88.7 games and easily winning the American League Central. Generally, you don't see that big a discrepancy between what their computer spits out and what the DraftKings sportsbook season win totals are. So I do think it's notable that people look, I don't think anyone has forgotten that Carlos Correa ended up on the Twins, but maybe if you didn't really follow that saga through its entirety, people are going to see this Twins roster. And even the Twins went through this little mini signing spree after they didn't retain Carlos Correa. They went out and got Joey Gallo. They traded for some pitching depth. They got Kyle Farmer. Again, these aren't names that are going to blow anyone away, but if there was one issue the Twins had last season, it was depth. And I think they've done a really nice job. Even Michael A. Taylor, they've done a really nice job of building up their organizational depth.
Okay, we are out of time. We need to go, but we are just scratching the surface as it pertains to Major League Baseball. Keep an eye on Jules Bukes. They'll be all over it. More so Bukes. Jules, thanks for the help. You really helped carry our show today. So I will thank Julian Edlow for his contributions. Gary and Thorne, Matt and Naaman behind the scenes. Thank you as well. Thanks for tuning in to The Slate. You can tune into The Sweat starting tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern time, and we'll have The Slate. We'll dive into more golf with the PGA Tour continuing. Not as much name recognition, but golf will be on the subject will be one of the key subject matters